I am now telling people in life and early in their presentation, Alzheimer's is one of the causes, or it is not a cause, etc. And that has absolutely transformed not just how we talk about the disease, but also the illness experience. Because gone is the mystery that sort of surrounded these diagnoses. You really don't know, you're really never sure, and now is that kind of certainty.
Welcome to Brainstorm by Us Against Alzheimer's, a patient-centered nonprofit organization. Your host, Meryl Comer, is a co-founder, 24-year caregiver, an Emmy Award-winning journalist, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, Slow Dancing with a Stranger.
This is Brainstorm, and I'm Meryl Comer. Today, Alzheimer's is increasingly defined by biological markers such as amyloid, beta, and tau changes seen in blood tests or brain scans rather than symptoms alone. This means the disease can sometimes be detected years before memory loss begins or is outwardly evident. Joining us is Dr. Jason Karlawish, professor of medicine, medical ethics, health policy, and neurology at the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the author of The Problems of Alzheimer's and Stats Neurotransmission columns. Welcome, Dr. Karlawish. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Meryl. Thanks so much for having me.
As co-director of the Penn Memory Center, you've written about how Alzheimer's went from a rare disease to a public health crisis. You've also argued that we created Alzheimer's as much as we discovered it. Give our audience a SparkNotes version of what you really mean.
Sure. Yeah. That's the central thesis of my book, The Problem of Alzheimer's. The subtitle is How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis. Yeah, simply put, Alzheimer's disease is a real disease. There's real pathobiology going on. But like all diseases, there's aspects of social construction. That is to say, it takes humans to turn this into a disease and therefore have an illness experience. At the beginning of the 20th century, we were still debating what it meant to be a fully autonomous adult. Well, that all kind of got sorted out by the mid to late 20th century, such that losing one's autonomy became a dreaded event in life. And I think that was one of the cultural events that had us look at aging and say, losing one's mind is pretty awful. Science comes along and says, well, in fact, that might be because there's problems in the brain, pathology. So maybe we could help. So those were two events in science and culture that really moved what was considered normal aging and just that's what happens to older adults to something we just didn't really like and we ought to do something about it. So that's how science, culture, and politics all work together to take what was a rare disease, turn it into a common one, and then make it a crisis.
Well, we're now diagnosing Alzheimer's earlier and earlier, sometimes in people with no symptoms based on biomarkers alone. How early do you think we should be offering biomarker testing to patients? And what safeguards need to be in place around disclosure and follow-up?
Right now, I think the science supports using biomarkers to diagnose Alzheimer's and also some of the other causes of dementia, like Lewy body disease, where we can get biomarkers. I think the science supports it in individuals who are having signs and symptoms of changes in their cognition, perception, and behavior that raise the concern of a neurodegenerative disease. I don't think the science is here yet to use those technologies in individuals who have absolutely no cognitive problems. We're very close, though, as potentially within 12, 24 months, we may move into that space. The safeguards that are needed for individuals who have symptoms, I think, revolve a lot around getting a proper informed consent, around the knowledge, the uncertainties that surround these tests, and how people will use them if they do get the results, and how they'll impact their lives.
What have you learned from your Greenwall Foundation funded work on how people decide whether to take these new treatments and what surprises you about their decision making?
I'm so glad you brought that study up. We got funding from the Greenwall Foundation, which is a foundation based out of New York that focuses on bioethics research. And my colleague, Justin Clapp at Penn, who's a medical anthropologist, leads this study. And he's embedded himself in our Alzheimer's Center to learn how the clinicians are using these extraordinarily new treatments, the anti-amyloid antibodies and the related biomarkers for diagnosis. He also interviewed all the clinicians prescribing, and most importantly, interviewed patients and caregivers who chose to take therapy or chose not to take therapy. And we're in the midst of analyzing those data now. So some highlight points. It's a complicated decision. Granted, for some, it's a no-brainer, no pun intended. We're going to do this. But once in the group where there's deliberation, there's a host of factors there. And what struck me as most interesting is the interrelated interests and needs of both the patient and the caregiver with respect to whether this therapy is the right thing to do. The therapies are a lot of work. They're not a guarantee of success, and they come with risks. And in individuals who have impairment, it's a tough decision to make. And for family members, it's a tough decision to make whether now's the right time to want to slow this disease down or not. And that for some, that leads to the decision to say, it's too late right now. Granted, most have been wanting to take the therapy, but for concerns about the risks, or if it's not appropriate for them after they're worked up.
USA Two's Brain Guide recently had its 1 millionth visitor for its confidential memory questionnaire and resources for doctors' follow-up, available clinical trials. Brain health supplements are projected to reach about $20 billion
Is that
by
all?
2031. And cognition supplements alone, another variety, at $27.4 billion in 2030. So I guess my question is, are younger cohorts likely to have different attitudes about knowing their risk status in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. And this gets back to the culture point we were talking about. I think individuals, and I'm just going to put a rough number here, 50 and under, they grew up in a world where autonomy, individuality, becoming a person was just part of the culture we lived in. And I think they amplify the threat that is dementia appropriately. Namely, I don't want to lose my ability to be me. That doesn't mean a selfish me. It just means me enjoying and being agentive in the world, perhaps wrapped up in a host of interesting relationships. And I think for that cohort especially, the threat of dementia is particularly dreaded, not viewed as something to be, it's just part of life, et cetera. And yes, I think the fact that the industries for supplements, testing are taking off, I think shows the desire for people to get information and do something. Now, we could debate whether what they're doing is worth their time and money, but I think that their behavior, their willingness to put their money on these things shows you the interest in wanting to do something about this disease, which is very different. I think you and I can both remember from, say, 30 years ago, where there was just indifference and whatnot.
There are blood tests for Alzheimer's. There are also genetic tests. I took the genetic test. I know I'm a 3-4. So I know my risk profile is higher. What does each test tell you as a doctor? And how do you decide when to use them? And what's the difference?
The genetic test, your genes were your genes the moment your zygote was sort of created, even before it implanted on your mother's womb. And so those are your genes. I'm not discounting their role in risk. I think the more interesting measures to get are the biomarkers, namely their measures of pathophysiology, so the dynamic appearance of signs of a disease unfolding in a body. The biomarkers are allowing us to say to someone who has signs and symptoms whether one of the causes of their signs and symptoms is Alzheimer's or Lewy body disease. We're getting close with TDP disease, which causes late. That has utterly revolutionized clinical practice. I've been doing this now since basically 1998, since the last century. And, for a long time, diagnoses were probable, meaning here's what I think it might be. It really looks like this. I'll follow you along. That might firm up the certainty. Ultimately, though, the certainty will arrive when I can get your brain tissue. But of course, that means you have to die, rather gruesome. Then the neuropathologist will tell us what happened. Well, those days are beginning to fade. I am now telling people in life and early in their presentation, Alzheimer's is one of the causes, or it is not a cause, et cetera. And that has absolutely transformed not just how we talk about the disease, but also the illness experience. Because gone is the mystery that sort of surrounded these diagnoses. You really don't know, you're really never sure, et cetera. And now is that kind of certainty. The test that I think is most interesting is the ability to measure tau using a PET scan, because there I can actually show you in your brain where the disease is unfolding. So it's not just that it's there, it's here it is. And that's why you're having trouble with your mental map.
You keep mentioning signs and symptoms. So tell me the signs and symptoms that would prompt you to say it's the right time to take a blood test for Alzheimer's disease.
Changes in cognitive abilities that are causing either inefficiencies or disabilities in daily life. So what do I mean by inefficiencies? It takes you longer to get things done that you used to do at a quicker, easier pace, finances, whatever, cooking, etc. Disabilities, you're making mistakes that you might catch or others catch. That needs a workup, and depending on that workup, it may lead to getting a biomarker test. And the reason why I say may is there are a host of reasons, particularly for the inefficiencies in daily life caused by cognitive problems that are not neurodegenerative, poorly treated sleep apnea. I saw someone who was on a regular daily dose of Benadryl for sleep and Ativan, and frankly, also a little bit too much hooch. All those behaviors taken away, the cognition improved, etc. But that's part of the workup.
Is there a direct correlation between a positive result on a blood test and a timeline for a formal Alzheimer's or mixed dementia diagnosis?
Well, that's getting to the variabilities in clinical practice across America. You can get some of these blood tests through the direct-to-consumer route. There's at least 6 companies offering it. I do not recommend folks pursuing that avenue. I've looked at the websites. I'm not confident in the cut points they're using. Moreover, they're not terribly well attached to the kind of additional workup one needs. But once it's prescribed by a physician, it ought to be coupled to a clear plan for follow-up and et cetera. Warning to your listeners, the Cures Act, an act of Congress that did a whole host of modifications to Medicare, one of its requirements is all test results, all medical records are available to patients the moment they're created. So here's a heads up to listeners. You get an Alzheimer's blood test, it's going to pop into your medical record, and you're going to get that ping on your email. You've got test results in your MyPen Medicine account. Log in and look. I strongly counsel my folks, you're welcome to look, but I would urge you simply to wait till we have our follow-up visit to go over the results and let me help you interpret them, as opposed to just seeing this cut point and what it says.
Different communities have different risks for Alzheimer's. I mean, the Latino population begins showing symptoms perhaps 7 years earlier than non-Hispanic whites. African Americans twice as likely to develop dementia, but 35% less likely to be diagnosed at all. How do we ensure equity in getting to a timely diagnosis and that everyone's being screened appropriately?
Well, I think the inequities around timely diagnosis that you're showing reflect larger inequities in our healthcare system, where access is often limited based on income, et cetera. I think the big challenge that all of America faces, which is amplified in this topic of that you've raised, is we do not have the adequate infrastructure set up to properly address the challenge of diagnosing and treating the many, frankly, millions of Americans who have cognitive impairment. And I'll give you one very focused problem. If you finish a medical residency, if you finish a neurology residency in the United States, the odds are you did not get any substantial training in cognitive neurology. You got great training in stroke, epilepsy, neurocritical care, but very little, if any, training in cognitive neurology, which is the field that is skilled in the diagnosis and treatment of Alzheimer's disease and other diseases. If you finish a geriatrics residency, you're pretty good at a geriatrics fellowship, you're pretty good at diagnosing dementia, but that's often for many, that's about as far as they get. So there's a real need to train a workforce competent to do this. And the problems you raised around inequities of diagnosis only amplify the need to address this.
You've written about the reluctance among doctors to diagnose for Alzheimer's or related cognitive disorders. What factors do you believe contribute most to the hesitation within the medical profession?
Yes, here I reach to the Bible, to the book of Genesis, where once dinosaurs roamed the earth. There are some dinosaurs roaming the medical hallways, namely physicians who just don't get it. They don't feel the need to do this. I think it reflects a couple things explicit and a couple implicit. Explicit, they don't think there's anything you can do. Nothing to do. And they're of the view, well, in the end, just the women will take care of these people. They do it anyway, so what's the point in diagnosing? It's a view locked in about 1980.
Or don't depress them.
I think a lot of it, though, is they don't have the skill. And doctors do not like to admit two things: uncertainty and lack of skill. In other words, it's very hard for a doctor to say, you know what, the problem you're telling me is one that I don't really feel confident working up, and I need to find someone else who can take care of it. You know, early stage assessments are often haunted by uncertainty about whether or not there's a problem here until you really do a good workup. Doctors don't like to admit those things. So I think there's a host of physicians out there who have these implicit and explicit biases. And we see this in our own health system. We are attempting to transform my friend and colleague, Dr. Kira O'Brien, Penn Medicine, and we're making great progress. But in doing this, we are encountering some physicians who will write back to us and say, I don't understand why we would do this. There's nothing you can do. It's not very accurate. All you're going to do is depress these people. But the good news is we've got plenty of physicians who are like, thank you. Get me these tools. Get me the training. I really want to make this part of my practice. And I think, again, back to Genesis, once upon a time, dinosaurs roamed the earth. I think over time, these dinosaurs will no longer roam the earth.
I attributed it to paternalism, which really always upset me. Just tell me what it is if you know, or tell me you don't know.
Dan Gibbs, the physician who has Alzheimer's, admits that the patients he least liked working up were the dementia patients when he was a neurologist. And it was part of it was there's nothing you can really do and the uncertainty that surrounded it. That's a step a doctor has to take when it comes to a dementia workup. I'm not very good at working this up. I need to have someone to refer to. But then that gets to our other problem. Who do you send them to? And this is the wait list that we have at the Memory Center is 6 months. We had to halt new patient appointments because we had such a backlog. We said, if we don't just stop taking in new patients, we'll never get through this backlog.
You mentioned stigma. The greatest concern for many advocates is that it's just trending younger with earlier diagnosis. So my question is, what ethical considerations arise when clinicians must disclose uncertainty to individuals diagnosed with Alzheimer's in midlife compared to those diagnosed later in life?
I think the diagnoses in individuals under the classic ages of retirement, 65, 70, have some unique challenges. And they relate to aspects of the fifth, sixth decade of life for many are decades of very important acceleration of bringing in income. And so it's a tough diagnosis to give someone who's 58 and now very well is going to have to step out of the workforce. And if they're in the workforce, which many are, the other challenge is if they went back to the job and said, oh, I've got some news, the employment discrimination that they are going to face is real and vivid. This gets back to the stigmas. This is a public stigma issue. And so these matters are of intense importance, I think, and a huge social policy issue that we're going to need to face.
Do you think that our current labels, mild cognitive impairment, MCI, dementia, Alzheimer's, I mean, when you label someone, you label them. And does it help or harm patients, families, clinicians?
Well, the nomenclature in this field is really in a big flux. Once upon a time, Alzheimer's and dementia were synonymous terms because if you didn't have dementia, you couldn't have Alzheimer's. And that lingers still in some of our nomenclature. And I could go on. I will with Alzheimer's has at least three meanings: synonymous with dementia, a pathophysiologic entity defined by tau and plaques, tau tangles and amyloid plaques. And it's also used as an umbrella term to describe all causes, if you will, of dementia. So, and then you put MCI in the mix and it only gets more complicated. Having said that, dementia is the problem, okay? I mean, if we didn't have disabling cognitive impairments, this wouldn't be so bad. I'm not trying to say MCI is not a problem, but one can figure out how to live with MCI as well as dementia. For most patients, we should not stop at a label of MCI or dementia. The next question is what's causing? What's the disease or diseases? In some cases, the answer is I'm not sure. The tests I've done are indeterminate or negative. But I think we owe people that as close to final answer as what disease or diseases might be causing this. I do think the MCI term, it has a historical problem to it. Namely, it was a risk factor for Alzheimer's back when to have Alzheimer's meant you had to have dementia. And so it's sort of caught in this kind of weird historical moment when I would remember telling people, you've got MCI, it's a risk factor for Alzheimer's. Well, that's just not the case anymore. I can tell you that you have MCI caused by Alzheimer's based on the results of biomarker tests and really good phenotyping. And so I'm kind of left with what's the value of the MCI label? And because the other problem I have with it is that the very name kind of makes it sound like a kind of nothing burger, and it also just says back to the patient what they've told you anyway. I've got cognitive impairment and it's sort of mild. And so it's a quirky term that I'd like to kind of see replaced and retired.
There are groups out there trying to get rid of the term dementia, which is a medical term, right?
Yeah, I'm not ready to retire dementia. I think we can learn to live with it because as we change the mystery that surrounds dementia, I think there's a larger thing going on here. That the mystery and the horror that surrounds Alzheimer's and dementia is beginning to be chipped away at. The ability to diagnose people and explain what's wrong. In the case of Alzheimer's, the ability to treat it with anti-amyloid therapies, the ability of the beginning to provide better services and supports through things like the GUIDE program. So that's why I think this let's stop using the word dementia is a kind of a language police solution to a larger cultural problem, which will work itself out. Now, it doesn't help when politicians use dementia as a cudgel against their opponents, which was done in the last election. And so there's some need for a little mature behavior, if it's possible, in some of the spheres of culture, which enjoy using dementia as a political cudgel.
You've been very generous with your time. Our guest has been Dr. Jason Karlawish, Professor of Medicine, Medical Ethics, Health Policy, and Neurology at the University of Pennsylvania, co-director of the Penn Memory Center. You can catch his podcast, The Age of Aging, dedicated to living well with an aging mind, and neurotransmission essays in STAT that looks at the vast problems of dementia. That's it for this edition. I'm Meryl Comer. Thank you for brainstorming with us.
Subscribe to Brainstorm through your favorite podcast platform and join us for new episodes on the first and third Tuesday of every month.